Julia Morris couldn't breathe. 5 years in a wheelchair had taught her to handle all kinds of physical challenges, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The Napa Valley sun beat down on her vintage lace dress as she sat frozen at the end of the aisle, 200 pairs of eyes fixed on her, witnessing her most intimate humiliation. "I'm sorry, Julia. I just can't do this." Robert's voice carried across the stunned silence of the vineyard. His handsome face, once so full of love, now twisted with something between pity and disgust. "I thought I could handle it, but I can't spend my life like this, with these limitations." Julia's hands gripped the wheels of her chair so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She had spent months planning this day, their perfect wedding. The flowers, the music, the venue with its wheelchair-accessible pathways. She'd thought of everything. Everything except the possibility that her fiancé might leave her at the altar. Her mother rushed forward from the front row, face pale with shock. "Robert, what are you doing?" she hissed, but Julia raised a hand to stop her. "Don't," Julia said, surprised at how steady her voice sounded despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. "Let him speak." Robert shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Julia, you're amazing. You really are. But this isn't the life I signed up for when we first met. I need someone who can—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound as cruel as they felt. "Someone who can keep up with me." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Julia's best friend Melissa muttered something that sounded suspiciously like a death threat from the front row. 5 years. 5 years since the car accident that had crushed her spine and ended her dancing career. 5 years of physical therapy, of learning to navigate the world from a seated position. 5 years during which Robert had promised his love was unchanged, that her wheelchair didn't matter to him. All lies, apparently. "I understand," Julia said, though she didn't. Not really. How could anyone understand having their heart ripped out in front of everyone they loved? The priest, clearly unsure of protocol for abandoned brides, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should— I'll marry her." The voice came from the back of the gathering. Deep, confident, and completely unfamiliar to Julia. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as a man Julia had never seen before walked down the aisle toward her. He was tall, with broad shoulders and dark hair that caught the sunlight. His suit probably cost more than the entire wedding. But it was his eyes that held Julia's attention, intense, determined, and focused entirely on her. "If she'll have me," the stranger added, coming to stand beside her wheelchair. Julia's mouth fell open. "I don't even know who you are." The man smiled, a small quirk of his lips that somehow transformed his serious face. "Nathaniel Cross." He extended his hand as if they were meeting at a business lunch rather than in the middle of her disastrous wedding. Julia heard several guests murmur in recognition. The name meant nothing to her, but clearly it meant something to others. "You can't be serious," Robert sputtered, finally finding his voice. "I've never been more serious in my life," Nathaniel replied without sparing him a glance. His eyes remained fixed on Julia's. "What do you say, Ms. Morris?" The rational part of Julia's brain screamed that this was insane. You didn't accept marriage proposals from complete strangers, no matter how handsome or apparently wealthy they might be. But another part, the part currently bleeding from Robert's rejection, whispered that maybe this was the universe balancing the scales. Before she could respond, Nathaniel crouched down to her level, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "Say yes now, and we'll figure out the details later. No one deserves to be humiliated like this." His eyes held no pity, only a strange understanding that resonated with something deep inside her. Julia found herself nodding before she fully processed what she was agreeing to. Nathaniel straightened and turned to face the gaping crowd. "The wedding will proceed as planned, with a slight change in groom." His confident tone dared anyone to object. Julia's mother pushed through to her side. "Julia, sweetheart, you can't possibly—" "Mom," Julia cut her off quietly. "Trust me." Though how her mother was supposed to trust a decision Julia herself didn't understand, she couldn't say. The next hour passed in a blur. Somehow, Nathaniel Cross took control of the chaos, speaking briefly with the priest, calming the confused guests, and arranging for Robert to be escorted from the premises when he refused to leave quietly. By sunset, Julia Morris had become Julia Cross in what had to be the strangest wedding in Napa Valley history. She sat in her wheelchair at the reception, sipping champagne and watching her new husband charm her family and friends as if he'd known them for years. "You're not drinking," Julia observed when Nathaniel rejoined her at the table, setting down a glass of sparkling water. "I never drink when making business decisions," he replied, then winced. "Sorry, that came out wrong." Julia laughed, the sound surprising her. She hadn't expected to laugh today, especially not after what happened. "Is that what this is? A business decision?" Nathaniel considered her question. "In a manner of speaking, though not the kind you're thinking of." "And what kind am I thinking of?" "The transactional kind." His gaze was direct, almost uncomfortably so. "You think I want something from you?" "Don't you?" Julia challenged. "People don't marry strangers out of the goodness of their hearts, Mr. Cross." "Nathaniel," he corrected, "and some do. Though I admit I'm not usually so impulsive." Julia studied him, trying to make sense of the man who had just upended her life. "Who are you, really? Why would you do this?" Nathaniel's expression became guarded. "I'm a businessman. I invest in things I believe have value." He paused. "And I know what it's like to be abandoned when you need someone most." Before Julia could press for details, her best friend Melissa appeared at her side, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "Julia, can we talk? Alone?" Melissa's eyes flicked meaningfully to Nathaniel. "I'll get us some food," Nathaniel said smoothly, rising from his seat. "Wedding cake is a tradition I do believe in." As soon as he was out of earshot, Melissa leaned in. "Have you lost your mind? You just married a complete stranger." "I'm aware," Julia said dryly. "Do you know who he is?" "Nathaniel Cross is one of the richest men in the country. He owns half of San Francisco's financial district, and he's famous for being a recluse. No one knows anything about his personal life." Julia glanced across the room where Nathaniel was chatting with her uncle, looking for all the world like he belonged there. "Well, that explains the suit." "This isn't funny, Jules. What's his angle? Men like that don't just swoop in and marry women they've never met." Julia's smile faded. "Maybe he felt sorry for me." "That's worse. You don't need pity, especially not from some billionaire with God knows what kind of secrets." "What I needed was to not be humiliated in front of everyone I know," Julia countered, her voice hardening. "And he prevented that." Melissa softened, squeezing Julia's hand. "I know today was awful. Robert is human garbage, and I've already arranged for his car to be towed. But this?" She nodded toward Nathaniel. "This is crazy, even for a rebound." "It's temporary," Julia assured her, though she had no idea if that was true. She and Nathaniel hadn't discussed any details beyond getting through the day. "Once the dust settles, we'll figure out an annulment or something." Melissa didn't look convinced. "Promise me you'll be careful. Men with that kind of power are used to getting what they want." "I think I can handle myself," Julia said, though her confidence was mostly for show. In truth, she felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether she was about to fly or fall. The evening continued in its surreal fashion. Julia found herself actually enjoying parts of her reception, particularly watching Robert's mother's face when Nathaniel kissed her hand during their first dance. Julia seated in her wheelchair. Nathaniel crouched beside her, moving them in gentle circles on the dance floor. By the time the last guests departed, exhaustion had settled deep in Julia's bones. The emotional whiplash of the day had left her drained. "Where to now?" Nathaniel asked, as his driver brought around a sleek black car equipped with a wheelchair lift that definitely hadn't been part of Julia's wedding plan. "I have an apartment in the city," Julia began, then faltered. What was the protocol here? They were legally married, but strangers nonetheless. "I have a penthouse with a guest suite," Nathaniel offered, seeming to read her uncertainty. "It's wheelchair accessible. You're welcome to stay there while we sort things out." Julia hesitated. Going home to her empty apartment felt unbearable, but going home with this stranger felt equally daunting. "I don't bite," Nathaniel added with a small smile. "And I think we have some details to discuss, don't you?" Julia nodded slowly. "Like why a billionaire would marry a woman he's never met. Among other things." He held her gaze. "I promise you'll get answers. And after that, whatever you decide happens next, I'll respect it." As the car pulled away from the vineyard, Julia looked back at the venue that was supposed to have hosted her fairy tale ending. Instead, it had witnessed the beginning of something entirely unexpected. "For what it's worth," Nathaniel said quietly beside her, "I think Robert Wilkins is the biggest fool in California." Despite everything, Julia found herself smiling. Whatever game Nathaniel Cross was playing, at least it had saved her from facing the ruins of her wedding day alone. Tomorrow would bring questions, complications, and probably regrets. But tonight, as the Napa Valley lights receded behind them and San Francisco glittered ahead, Julia allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the day's disaster might lead somewhere worth going. What she couldn't know was just how many secrets her new husband was keeping, or how completely her life was about to change. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a gleaming skyscraper in downtown San Francisco. As the private elevator doors opened, Julia's breath caught. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline and the bay beyond, glittering with lights against the night sky. "This is where you live?" she asked, wheeling herself forward onto smooth hardwood floors that had clearly been designed with wheelchair access in mind. No thresholds, wide doorways, everything positioned at the perfect height. "One of my places," Nathaniel replied, loosening his tie as he followed her inside. "I had it renovated last year." Julia raised an eyebrow. "You renovated your penthouse to be wheelchair accessible before you met me?" A shadow passed over Nathaniel's face. "I have my reasons." He moved toward what appeared to be a bar built into the wall. "Drink? You look like you could use one." "I think I earned at least 2 after today," Julia said, still trying to process the surreal turn her life had taken. 6 hours ago, she'd been preparing to marry Robert. Now she sat in a stranger's penthouse, legally married to a man she knew nothing about. Nathaniel poured amber liquid into 2 glasses and brought one to her. "Bourbon. It helps with catastrophes." "Is that what this is?" Julia accepted the drink. "A catastrophe?" "That depends entirely on what we decide to do next." Nathaniel settled into a chair across from her, studying her over the rim of his glass. Julia took a long sip, feeling the liquor burn a path down her throat. "I think that's my line. You're the one who proposed to a total stranger in the middle of her failed wedding." "Fair point." Nathaniel set his glass down. "I suppose I owe you an explanation." "Just one?" Julia's laugh held no humor. "I have about 50 questions, starting with how you even ended up at my wedding. I don't know you. I've never met you before today." Nathaniel's expression remained unreadable. "I was there for the vineyard, not the wedding. I'm considering buying the property. The owner invited me to see it in operation." He paused. "Your ceremony was happening when I arrived." "And you just decided what?" "That proposing to the abandoned bride would make a good anecdote for your next dinner party." "I don't host dinner parties." His voice remained calm despite her tone. "I saw a woman being humiliated by a man who clearly didn't deserve her. I made a decision. A decision to marry me." Julia shook her head in disbelief. "Normal people just offer a shoulder to cry on, or a ride home." "I've never been accused of being normal." The corner of Nathaniel's mouth lifted slightly. "And I don't do things halfway." Julia wheeled closer to him, searching his face for any sign of deception. "What do you want from me, Nathaniel? Money? I don't have any. Some kind of trophy wife. Because I'm not exactly the society page's idea of arm candy." She gestured to her wheelchair. Nathaniel's expression hardened. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Define yourself by that chair. It's a tool, not an identity." His words hit her with unexpected force. Robert had always acted as if her wheelchair was something they needed to work around, a problem to be managed. Nathaniel spoke as if it were simply a fact, no different than her height or hair color. "You didn't answer my question," she pressed. "What do you want?" Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "Companionship, perhaps, on my terms." He held up a hand when she started to protest. "And yours? Equal terms." "Companionship," Julia repeated flatly. "You could join a book club for that." "I'm not good with groups." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Here's my proposal. A real one this time. We stay married for 1 year. A mutually beneficial arrangement." Julia nearly choked on her bourbon. "And how exactly would that benefit me?" "Financial security for one. I'll set up an account in your name with enough funds to ensure you never have to worry about money again, whether you stay with me or not." His eyes held hers. "Freedom to pursue your art without commercial constraints. I've seen your work. It's exceptional." Julia's surprise must have shown on her face because Nathaniel continued, "Yes, I know you're an artist. I made it my business to learn about you during the reception. Your paintings show remarkable talent. You researched me while we were getting married." Julia didn't know whether to be flattered or disturbed. "I never enter an arrangement without due diligence." Nathaniel took another sip of his drink. "I also know you've been struggling to break into the art world. Galleries claim to love your work, but can't risk signing an unknown name." He wasn't wrong. Since the accident, Julia had poured herself into painting, transforming her physical limitations into creative freedom on canvas. But the art world had proven just as inaccessible as much of the physical world. "And you think being Mrs. Cross will change that?" The title felt foreign on her tongue. "I know it will. The Cross name opens doors. My connections extend to every major gallery in the country." He said this not with arrogance, but as a simple statement of fact. "You would have the platform your talent deserves." Julia tried to ignore the flicker of temptation his words ignited. "And what do you get out of this?" Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression, a vulnerability so brief she might have imagined it. "I have my reasons for needing a wife. Business reasons, personal reasons. They're complicated." "Try me. I'm pretty smart for a charity case." His brow furrowed. "You're not a charity case, Julia. Far from it." "Then explain it to me. Why me? Why now?" Nathaniel stood abruptly, walking to the window. His silhouette cut a sharp figure against the city lights. "My father is dying," he said after a long pause. "Brain cancer. 3 months, maybe less." This wasn't what Julia had expected. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Don't be. He's not a good man." Nathaniel's voice was tight. "But he controls the family trust. Billions in assets that will revert to a charitable foundation upon his death unless I fulfill certain conditions he's set." Julia began to understand. "And one of those conditions is marriage." Nathaniel nodded without turning. "By my 35th birthday, which happens to be in 2 weeks." "That's," Julia searched for words, "archaic. My father is nothing if not old-fashioned." Bitterness laced Nathaniel's tone. "He believes a man isn't complete without a wife. Doesn't matter who she is as long as the paperwork is filed." "And you were willing to marry a complete stranger just to secure your inheritance?" The idea stung, though Julia wasn't sure why. It wasn't as if she'd expected romance from this bizarre situation. Nathaniel finally turned to face her. "The money isn't for me. It's for thousands of employees whose livelihoods depend on Cross Industries continuing to operate. If the foundation takes over, restructuring would be inevitable. People would lose their jobs. Julia studied him, trying to separate truth from convenient fiction. That's very noble, or a very good story. Believe what you want. It's the truth. He moved back to his chair. When I saw what happened at your wedding, I made a split-second decision. We could help each other. A business arrangement, Julia said, echoing his earlier words. Yes, though I'd hope we could become friends at least. Julia took another sip of bourbon, letting its warmth spread through her. And after the year is up? We go our separate ways if that's what you want. No strings, no obligations. You keep the financial settlement regardless. It sounded too good to be true, which usually meant it was. Why don't you just find someone who's in on the plan? Someone from your world? I've tried. Society women want more than a temporary arrangement. They want the full commitment. Emotional, physical. His expression darkened. I can't offer that. Can't or won't. Both. The finality in his voice closed that line of questioning. Julia wheeled herself to the window, needing space to think. The city stretched below her, a tapestry of lights and possibilities she'd never considered. Today had been a disaster, yes, but maybe also an opportunity. What was waiting for her back at her small apartment? Sympathetic friends? Pitying looks? A stack of wedding gifts to return? If I agree, she said slowly, I want it clear that this is a partnership of equals. I won't be a puppet or a showpiece. I wouldn't want you to be. And I need independence. My own projects, my own time. Nathaniel nodded. Of course. I have my own work that keeps me busy. Julia turned to face him. I want it in writing. Everything. The financial arrangements, the timeline, the expectations. A small smile played at Nathaniel's lips. I'd be disappointed if you didn't insist on that. And one more thing. Julia held his gaze. I need to know who I'm really dealing with, not the public version of Nathaniel Cross. The real one. Something unreadable flickered across his face. That might take more than a year. We can start with why you actually renovated this place to be wheelchair accessible. Nathaniel went still. For a moment, Julia thought he might refuse to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. My sister, Claire. She was in an accident 3 years ago. A diving incident, spinal cord injury. He looked away. This was her place. I had it modified when she moved in with me after rehab. Had it modified? Past tense? Julia felt a chill despite the warmth of the penthouse. She died last year. Complications from pneumonia. The words were clipped, clinical, but Julia didn't miss the pain beneath them. The doctors said her immune system was compromised from the injury. I'm sorry, Julia said, and meant it. That explains a lot. Does it? His eyes met hers, challenging. Why you didn't see my wheelchair as something to pity? Why you stepped in today? Julia wheeled closer to him. You saw Robert reject me because of this chair, and it reminded you of your sister. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Claire faced her share of rejection after her accident. Friends who couldn't handle the new reality. A fiancé who suddenly remembered a pressing overseas assignment. The parallels weren't lost on Julia. So I'm what? A chance to rewrite that story? You're not my sister, Nathaniel said firmly. This isn't about replacing her or fixing the past. But yes, when I saw what was happening, I couldn't stand by and watch. Julia nodded slowly. His explanation made sense, though she suspected there were layers he still wasn't revealing. But it was a start. 1 year, she said finally. 1 year of marriage, and then we reevaluate. Relief flashed across Nathaniel's face before his composed mask returned. I'll have the paperwork drawn up tomorrow. And tonight? The guest suite is yours. It has everything you need. He stood, Their conversation clearly concluded in his mind. "I have an early meeting, but my assistant will be here at 9 to help you with anything you require." Julia raised an eyebrow. "You're already telling your staff about your new wife." "Sarah is more than staff. She knows everything." Nathaniel hesitated. "This arrangement, it requires discretion. The public story will be that we've been seeing each other quietly for some time." "A whirlwind romance?" Julia couldn't keep the sarcasm from her voice. "Something like that." He moved toward a hallway. "I'll show you to your room." The guest suite was larger than Julia's entire apartment, with its own bathroom equipped with accessible features that made her daily routine infinitely easier. As Nathaniel bid her goodnight, Julia found herself alone in luxurious surroundings that felt utterly foreign. She wheeled to the window, looking out at the unfamiliar view. 24 hours ago, she'd been full of hope for a future with Robert. Now she was legally bound to a stranger with secrets deeper than the bay outside her window. Julia reached for her phone, seeing dozens of missed calls and messages. Melissa had texted repeatedly, "Where are you? Are you okay? Did that billionaire kidnap you? Call me right now or I'm calling the police." With a sigh, Julia dialed her friend's number. "Oh my God, finally!" Melissa answered immediately. "Are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm fine," Julia said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I'm at Nathaniel's place." "His place? Julia, you don't even know him. Have you lost your mind?" "Maybe a little," Julia admitted. "But I know what I'm doing." "Do you?" "Because from where I'm standing, you just went home with a complete stranger on the same day your fiancé dumped you at the altar. That doesn't sound like knowing what you're doing. That sounds like trauma." Julia couldn't argue with that assessment. "It's complicated, Mel." "Uncomplicate it. Come home. Whatever knight in shining armor fantasy you're playing out, it's not healthy." "It's not a fantasy," Julia said firmly. "It's a business arrangement." There was a pause on the line. "Excuse me?" "Nathaniel and I have an agreement. We're staying married for now. It benefits us both." "Benefits you? Julia, are you hearing yourself? This sounds like something from a bad movie." "Maybe," Julia conceded. "But it's my choice. I need this, Mel. A fresh start. Something completely different." "Different doesn't have to mean insane." "I know what I'm doing," Julia repeated, more to convince herself than her friend. "Trust me, okay? I'll explain everything soon." After promising Melissa she wasn't being held against her will, Julia ended the call and prepared for bed. The bathroom was stocked with high-end toiletries, and someone had already placed a silk nightgown in her size on the bed. The thought that Nathaniel had arranged these details during the reception both impressed and unnerved her. As she settled into the impossibly comfortable bed, exhaustion finally overtook her. The day's emotional roller coaster caught up all at once, and Julia felt tears she'd been holding back begin to fall. She cried for her broken dreams, for Robert's betrayal, for the uncertain path ahead. When sleep finally came, Julia dreamed of falling from a great height, only to be caught by hands she couldn't see. She awoke with a start at dawn, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. A noise from the kitchen drew her attention. Julia transferred to her wheelchair and moved quietly through the suite, following the sound. She expected to find Nathaniel or perhaps his assistant, but instead discovered a thin man in a dark suit carefully opening cabinets. "Can I help you?" Julia asked, her voice sharper than intended. The man whirled around, clearly startled. Nothing about his appearance was threatening. Middle-aged, balding, with wire-rimmed glasses. But something in his eyes made Julia uneasy. "Mrs. Cross," he recovered quickly, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I apologize for disturbing you. I'm Harold Winters, Mr. Cross Sr.'s personal attorney." "Mr. Cross Sr.?" "Nathaniel's father." Winters straightened his tie. "I came to deliver some documents regarding the family trust. I didn't expect to find anyone here." Julia frowned. Does everyone in Nathaniel's life have a key to his home? Only those who need access. Winters studied her with undisguised curiosity. I must say, you're not what we expected when we learned Nathaniel had married. And what did you expect? Someone more… He paused deliberately. Suitable. The implication hung in the air between them. Before Julia could respond, a voice cut through the tension. Winters. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, his expression thunderous. What are you doing in my home? Delivering the updated trust documents, as requested. Winters held up a leather portfolio. Your father was quite interested to hear about your sudden marriage. Was he now? Nathaniel's voice was dangerously soft. And how exactly did he hear about it? News travels quickly in certain circles. Winters smiled thinly. He's requested a meeting. With both of you. Today. Julia felt the floor shift beneath her. Meeting Nathaniel's dying father hadn't been part of their arrangement. Certainly not on day one. That won't be possible, Nathaniel began, but Winters cut him off. He insists, and you know what happens when Harrison Cross is denied. The attorney turned to Julia with a smile that sent chills down her spine. Mrs. Cross, I look forward to seeing you again this afternoon. I do hope you're prepared. Harrison has so many questions about the woman who so suddenly captured his son's heart. As Winters left, the silence in the penthouse grew heavy. Nathaniel's face had gone pale. His composure finally cracked. I'm sorry, he said at last. This wasn't supposed to happen so quickly. Julia stared at him, the full reality of what she'd agreed to finally sinking in. Just how dangerous is your father, Nathaniel? His answer chilled her to the bone. He destroyed the last woman who tried to claim the Cross name. Nathaniel's eyes met hers, and he'll do the same to you if he suspects this marriage isn't real. Destroyed her how? Julia asked, her mouth suddenly dry. The morning sun filtering through the penthouse windows seemed to dim as the weight of Nathaniel's words settled between them. Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, a crack in his usually perfect composure. We should talk about this over breakfast. You must be hungry. I'm not hungry. I want answers. Julia wheeled her chair forward, blocking his path to the kitchen. If I'm about to meet someone dangerous, I need to know what I'm walking into. Nathaniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. He gestured toward the living room. Let's sit down. Once they were settled, Nathaniel leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. My father is difficult. He built Cross Industries from nothing, and he believes that gives him the right to control everything and everyone connected to the Cross name. Including your wife, Julia observed, especially my wife. Nathaniel's expression darkened. 5 years ago, my cousin Thomas married a woman named Eliza. She was smart, ambitious, worked as an environmental lawyer. My father thought she was only after the family money. Was she? No. She genuinely loved Thomas. Nathaniel's voice grew quiet. But that didn't matter to my father. He had her investigated, dug up everything he could find. Old boyfriends, college indiscretions, a DUI charge that had been expunged from her record. Julia felt a chill. What did he do with the information? He destroyed her career. Anonymous tips to her law firm about ethical violations that never happened. Pressure on clients to drop her. When that wasn't enough, he started on her personal life. How? Eliza had struggled with depression in college, had been hospitalized briefly after a suicide attempt. My father made sure Thomas found out, not directly from him, of course. He's too clever for that. He made it appear that Eliza had hidden this information deliberately. Julia felt sick. That's horrible. It gets worse. When Thomas confronted her, she admitted everything, explained that it was a dark period in her past that she'd worked through. Thomas forgave her. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. So my father escalated. He arranged for an old boyfriend to suddenly reappear, claiming they'd never really broken up, that she'd been seeing him throughout her marriage to Thomas. But that wasn't true. Completely false. But the man was deep in debt, and my father paid well. Nathaniel stood abruptly, moving to the window. The stress of it all triggered Eliza's depression again. Thomas tried to support her, but my father kept pushing. Anonymous letters, photos doctored to look like evidence of affairs. He even had someone call Thomas pretending to be a doctor, saying Eliza had been secretly treated for a personality disorder that made her pathologically lie. Julia stared at him in horror. What happened to her? Nathaniel turned, his face grim. She left Thomas a note saying she couldn't fight anymore, got in her car, and drove off a cliff in Malibu. The silence that followed was deafening. Julia tried to process what she'd just heard. Did your father admit what he'd done? Not openly, but at the funeral, he told Thomas it was for the best, that Eliza had been unstable and would have brought shame to the cross name eventually. Nathaniel's voice was flat. Thomas left the family business the next day. We haven't seen him since. Julia took a deep breath. And you think your father would do the same to me? Try to break me? If he believes our marriage threatens his control over the family fortune, yes. Nathaniel returned to sit across from her. That's why we need to be prepared before we meet him. He'll try to find cracks, inconsistencies in our story. We barely have a story, Julia pointed out. We met yesterday. Which is why we need to create one. Nathaniel checked his watch. We have about 5 hours before we need to leave for my father's estate. That's enough time to build a convincing narrative. Julia ran her hands over the wheels of her chair, a habit when she was thinking. So we need to become experts on each other by this afternoon. Exactly. For the first time that morning, Nathaniel's lips curved into a small smile. Consider it our first project as partners. The next few hours passed in a blur of information exchange. Over breakfast prepared by Nathaniel himself, a surprisingly good omelette, they covered the basics. Julia learned that Nathaniel was 34, turning 35 in 2 weeks, had graduated from Stanford with dual degrees in business and computer science, and had taken over as CEO of Cross Industries' technology division at 28 after proving himself with a series of successful startups. No siblings besides Claire? Julia asked, sipping her coffee. No, just us. My mother died when I was 12. Cancer. Nathaniel's tone made it clear this wasn't a topic for further discussion. Your family? Mom and Dad in Seattle, both retired teachers. One younger brother, Mark, who works as an engineer in Portland. Julia twirled her fork. They were all at the wedding, of course. I should probably call them soon. What will you tell them? Julia sighed. I don't know. The truth seems impossible. Hey, Mom! Good news! I'm not heartbroken because I married a billionaire stranger instead. Nathaniel winced. When you put it that way, it does sound slightly unhinged. Slightly? Julia laughed despite herself. My mom's probably having a meltdown as we speak. She was never a fan of Robert, but at least she'd had 4 years to get used to him. What did she dislike about him? Nathaniel appeared genuinely curious. Julia considered the question. She thought he was too concerned with appearances, too focused on his career at the expense of everything else. She paused. She wasn't wrong, as it turns out. And your father? Dad's quieter about his opinions, but I could tell he had reservations too. After my accident, Robert was different. Not at first, but gradually. He started making excuses about why I couldn't join him for work events, started planning activities he knew I couldn't participate in. Nathaniel's expression darkened. Setting you up to fail. Looking back, yes. Julia was surprised by how clearly she could see it now. I think he was laying the groundwork to leave for a long time. He just didn't have the courage to do it until yesterday. Courage would have been having that conversation in private, Nathaniel said. What he did was cowardice. Julia studied her new husband, struck by the genuine anger in his voice. For someone who claims this is just a business arrangement, you seem personally offended on my behalf. I don't like bullies, Nathaniel said simply, and I especially don't like men who make promises they have no intention of keeping. Something in his tone suggested personal experience. Julia filed that observation away for later. Anyway, she continued, my family will be surprised, to say the least. I'll need to tell them something. Tell them we've been seeing each other quietly for months. That after Robert left, I stepped in because I couldn't bear to see you hurt when I already knew I wanted to marry you. Julia raised an eyebrow. That's quite a story. The best lies contain elements of truth, Nathaniel said. I did step in because I couldn't bear to see you hurt. The timeline is the only fabrication. The simple sincerity in his voice caught Julia off guard. Before she could respond, Nathaniel's phone buzzed. Sarah's here with your things, he said, checking the message. I asked her to go to your apartment and pack some clothes and essentials. You what? Julia stared at him. You sent someone to my apartment without asking me? Nathaniel looked genuinely confused by her reaction. You needed your things. I was being efficient. You were being invasive, Julia countered. You can't just send people into my home to go through my personal belongings. Nathaniel appeared to recalibrate. You're right. I apologize. I should have asked first. The apology surprised her. Julia had expected defensiveness or justification. Thank you. Just ask next time, okay? This arrangement doesn't give you the right to make decisions about my life without consulting me. Nathaniel nodded. Noted. Though in the interest of full disclosure, Sarah also brought a few new items I thought you might need for today's meeting. My father expects a certain presentation. Presentation? Julia's eyes narrowed. What exactly does that mean? It means Harrison Cross believes his daughter-in-law should dress the part. Nathaniel looked uncomfortable. Designer clothes, jewelry, the works. So I need to look worthy of the Cross name? Julia couldn't keep the edge from her voice. No, Nathaniel said firmly. You're already worthy, but appearing in a way that meets my father's expectations will make this encounter easier. He held her gaze. Consider it armor for battle. Put that way, Julia could understand the logic, even if it grated against her principles. Fine, but I have final say on what I wear. Of course. Sarah, Nathaniel's assistant, proved to be a revelation. A tall woman with short salt and pepper hair and the efficiency of a military commander, she arrived with multiple suitcases and a no-nonsense attitude that Julia immediately appreciated. Mrs. Cross, she greeted Julia without a hint of surprise or judgment. I've brought your personal items, plus some options for today's meeting. I took the liberty of organizing everything by category and occasion. Thank you, Sarah, Julia said, still getting used to being addressed as Mrs. Cross. And please, call me Julia. Sarah nodded. Julia, then. The blue suitcase contains your own clothes and personal items. The black garment bags hold the new options. I've also scheduled a hairstylist and makeup artist to arrive in an hour, if that meets with your approval. Julia shot Nathaniel a look. He raised his hands in surrender. Your decision. After a moment's consideration, Julia nodded. That would be helpful, thank you. Excellent. Sarah checked her tablet. Mr. Cross, you have those documents to review before the meeting. I've put them in your office. I'll get to them now. Nathaniel turned to Julia. Will you be okay? The question seemed loaded with more concern than the situation warranted. I think I can manage to get dressed without supervision, Julia said dryly. A hint of a smile touched Nathaniel's lips. I have no doubt. I'll be in my office if you need anything. Once Nathaniel left, Sarah turned to Julia with a more relaxed expression. He's trying, you know. This isn't easy for him. Julia blinked, surprised by the personal comment. You seem to know him well. 8 years as his assistant. You learn a few things. Sarah began unpacking the garment bags with efficient movements. Nathaniel Cross is brilliant with business, but sometimes misses the mark with people, especially when he cares. When he cares, Julia repeated. We barely know each other. Sarah paused, giving Julia a measured look. Maybe, but I haven't seen him this protective of anyone since Claire. She resumed her task. Now, let's find you something that says, I belong here, without trying too hard. The next few hours were a whirlwind of preparation. The stylist Sarah had arranged was experienced with clients in wheelchairs, knowing exactly how to create a look that would work whether Julia was seated or standing. They settled on a tailored navy dress with an asymmetrical neckline that managed to be both elegant and comfortable. By the time they were ready to leave for Harrison Cross's estate, Julia hardly recognized herself in the mirror. Her usually practical hairstyle had been transformed into soft waves that framed her face, and her makeup enhanced her features without looking overdone. The diamond earrings Nathaniel had provided, just on loan, he'd assured her, caught the light with every movement. You look beautiful, Nathaniel said when she emerged from the bedroom. He'd changed into a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than Julia's rent for a year. I look like someone else, Julia admitted. No, Nathaniel shook his head. You look like exactly who you are, just with better accessories. The drive to Harrison Cross's estate took them north across the Golden Gate Bridge and into Marin County. As the city fell away behind them, Julia's anxiety grew. She kept thinking about Eliza, the woman who hadn't survived Harrison Cross's scrutiny. You're not her, Nathaniel said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. You're stronger. You don't know that, Julia countered. You don't really know me at all. I know enough. His confidence was somehow both irritating and reassuring. I saw how you handled yourself yesterday. When Robert abandoned you at the altar, you didn't fall apart. You held your ground. Having a breakdown in front of 200 people wasn't really an option. It was exactly an option. Most people would have taken it. Nathaniel's eyes met hers. But you didn't. You faced it head on. That's the kind of strength my father can't break. Julia wished she shared his certainty. What if I say the wrong thing? What if he sees through us? He'll try to trip you up, ask questions designed to expose inconsistencies. Nathaniel took her hand, the gesture surprisingly intimate. Just remember, short answers are safer than long ones. If you don't know something about me that you should, deflect with a personal detail we've discussed. And if all else fails, he squeezed her hand. I look at you with adoring eyes, Julia suggested sarcastically. You throw it back to me. Darling, you tell it so much better than I do. His impersonation of a besotted wife was so unexpected that Julia laughed. I'll try to remember that, darling. The estate came into view as their car rounded a bend in the private road. Julia's laughter died in her throat. The property was less a home than a fortress, a sprawling stone mansion set on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Manicured gardens surrounded the house, and a circular driveway led to imposing front doors that looked like they belonged on a medieval castle. Subtle, Julia remarked. My father has never aimed for subtlety. Nathaniel's expression had closed off, his earlier warmth replaced by the cool, controlled demeanor she was coming to recognize as his public face. Ready? Julia smoothed her dress, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. As I'll ever be. The driver helped with the wheelchair ramp, and soon they were approaching the entrance. Before they reached the doors, they swung open to reveal a thin man in a dark suit. Not Winters, but someone cut from the same cloth. Mr. Nathaniel, the man greeted them with a slight bow. Mrs. Cross, Mr. Harrison is waiting in the West Library. The interior of the mansion matched its imposing exterior. High ceilings, marble floors, artwork that probably belonged in museums. As they moved through the house, Julia noted that despite its grandeur, it felt cold, unlived in, more like a museum than a home. Nice place, she murmured to Nathaniel. Very warm and inviting. The corner of his mouth twitched. Wait until you see the dungeon." Before Julia could determine if he was joking, they arrived at a set of double doors. The butler knocked once, then opened them without waiting for a response. The West Library was a vast room lined with bookshelves that reached the ceiling. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the ocean, and a massive stone fireplace dominated one wall. In front of the fireplace, seated in a high-backed leather chair that resembled a throne, was Harrison Cross. Julia's first thought was that Nathaniel looked nothing like his father. Where Nathaniel was tall and lean, Harrison was stocky, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical power even as he approached 70. His white hair was still thick, cut in a military style, and his face was deeply lined, giving him the appearance of a weathered sea captain rather than a business tycoon. But it was his eyes that caught Julia's attention. Pale blue, almost colorless, and utterly cold. They fixed on her with the calculating assessment of a predator sizing up potential prey. "So," Harrison's voice filled the room, deep and commanding. "This is the bride." Nathaniel stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Julia's shoulder. "Father, this is Julia, my wife." Harrison made no move to rise or extend a hand in greeting. "Bring her closer. I want to see what kind of woman manages to secure a cross ring in less than a day." Julia fought the urge to shrink back. Instead, she wheeled herself forward without waiting for Nathaniel's assistance, stopping directly in front of Harrison's chair. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Cross," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Though I understand you're not well. We didn't need to rush this meeting." Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "Concerned for my health already? How touching." His gaze flicked to her wheelchair, then back to her face. "Nathaniel's taste has always been unconventional." Julia felt Nathaniel tense beside her. Before he could respond, she smiled. "Unconventional is just another word for interesting, don't you think? Conventional is so rarely memorable." Harrison studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he laughed. A short, sharp sound devoid of real humor. "Spirited, good. Weak women are tedious." He gestured to Winters, who materialized from a corner of the room. "Pour the drinks. Let's get this farce underway." As Winters served brandy, water for Harrison, which suggested his condition was indeed serious, Julia took the opportunity to observe the room more carefully. On a side table near Harrison's chair sat several framed photographs. Most appeared to be of Nathaniel at various ages, often in formal settings. One showed a young woman who must have been Claire, smiling brightly in a graduation cap and gown. But there was no sign of a mother, no family portraits that included a complete family unit. "So, Julia," Harrison's voice pulled her attention back. "Tell me how you and my son met. I find myself curious, given that Nathaniel has never mentioned your existence until yesterday." The challenge was clear. Julia glanced at Nathaniel, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod. "We met at a charity auction for spinal cord injury research," Julia said, keeping her voice casual. 6 months ago, Nathaniel outbid everyone for a painting that caught his eye. It happened to be mine. Harrison's gaze sharpened. "You're an artist?" "Yes, though I was attending as a donor that night, not expecting my work to be included in the auction." The story was flowing easily now, the details they'd crafted over breakfast coming together. "When Nathaniel found out I was the artist, he insisted on meeting me." "Insisted?" Harrison repeated, looking at his son. "That doesn't sound like you, Nathaniel. You usually avoid social interactions whenever possible." "Some things are worth making an exception for," Nathaniel replied, his hand finding Julia's shoulder again. The casual intimacy of the gesture seemed to surprise Harrison. "And you've been courting ever since?" Harrison's skepticism was palpable. "We've been seeing each other, yes," Julia confirmed. "Quietly, neither of us wanted public attention. Especially not from overly involved family members," Nathaniel added pointedly. Harrison ignored the barb. "And yesterday's wedding? Rather sudden, wasn't it?" Julia felt the trap being laid. If they claimed to have been planning the wedding for months, Harrison would demand to know why he hadn't been informed. If they admitted it was spontaneous, it would feed his suspicions about the marriage's legitimacy. "When you know, Julia said, opting for simplicity over elaboration. "We didn't see any reason to wait." "How convenient that your decision coincided so perfectly with the trust's marriage clause," Harrison observed dryly. "And just weeks before Nathaniel's 35th birthday." "Father," Nathaniel began, but Harrison cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Save your protest, Nathaniel. I wasn't born yesterday." He turned his cold eyes back to Julia. "What do you know about the Cross family trust, my dear?" Julia met his gaze steadily. "I know it exists. I know it's important to the company. Beyond that, Nathaniel and I don't discuss business matters much." "Really? No interest in the billions at stake?" "Money has never been my primary concern," Julia said truthfully. "If it was, I would have chosen a more profitable career than painting." Harrison studied her, searching for deception. "Your accident," he said abruptly, changing tactics. "When did it happen?" The question caught Julia off guard. 5 years ago." "And how did my son react when you told him about it?" Julia felt her heart rate increase. They hadn't discussed this specific scenario, but something told her that honesty, or a version of it, was her best option. "He didn't react the way most people do," she said slowly. "He didn't offer pity or discomfort or excessive help. He just accepted it as part of who I am." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "Because of Claire?" "Yes," Julia admitted. "I think his experience with his sister gave him a different perspective." For the first time, something genuine flickered across Harrison's face, a flash of grief quickly masked. Claire was always his weakness. "Compassion isn't weakness, Father," Nathaniel said quietly. "Isn't it?" Harrison leaned forward. "It certainly made you vulnerable enough to rush into marriage with the first woman who reminded you of her." The accusation hung in the air. Julia felt Nathaniel's hand tighten on her shoulder, felt the tension radiating from him. This was dangerous territory, too close to the partial truth of why Nathaniel had stepped in at her wedding. "Mr. Cross," Julia said, deliberately drawing Harrison's attention back to her. "Your son didn't marry me because I remind him of Claire. He married me because we connected in a way neither of us expected." She wheeled herself slightly forward, away from Nathaniel's touch. "And frankly, your assumption that a wheelchair is my defining characteristic says more about your limitations than mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison's pale eyes widened slightly, and beside her, Julia heard Nathaniel inhale sharply. Even Winters, lurking in the background, seemed to freeze. Then Harrison Cross did something completely unexpected. He smiled. A real smile that transformed his harsh features into something almost human. "Well," he said, looking at his son, "at least she has backbone. That's something." Before Nathaniel could respond, Harrison's expression changed. His face contorted in pain, and he pressed a hand to his temple. Winters immediately stepped forward, producing a pill bottle from his pocket. "Sir, your medication." Harrison waved him away irritably. "I'm fine." But his color had gone ashen, and a thin sheen of sweat had appeared on his forehead. "We should go," Nathaniel said, his voice tight with an emotion Julia couldn't identify. "You need to rest." "Don't tell me what I need," Harrison snapped, but the force had gone out of his words. He took the pills Winters offered, washing them down with water. "We're not finished here." "Yes, we are," Nathaniel said firmly. "Julia and I have met your condition. The trust requirements have been satisfied. There's nothing more to discuss." Harrison's pale eyes fixed on Julia once more. "This isn't over," he said, his voice weaker but no less menacing. "A marriage is more than a piece of paper. It requires proof, commitment, public recognition." What are you saying? Nathaniel asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Harrison's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile on a less forbidding face. I'm saying, welcome to the family, my dear. We'll make it official at the annual Cross Foundation Gala next week. All of San Francisco society will be there to meet the new Mrs. Cross. His gaze moved deliberately between them. I assume you won't object to publicly celebrating your love. Julia felt a chill despite the warmth of the room. This wasn't just a meeting. It was the opening move in what promised to be a dangerous game. We'll be there, Nathaniel said, his voice betraying nothing of his thoughts. Wonderful. Harrison leaned back in his chair, fatigue evident in his posture despite his triumphant expression. Oh, and Julia, one more thing. She met his gaze steadily. Yes? If you're planning to take my son for a fool, know this. His voice dropped to a near whisper. I protect what's mine. Always. By any means necessary. The threat couldn't have been clearer. As Nathaniel wheeled her from the room, Julia finally understood what they were truly up against. This wasn't just about satisfying a trust condition or navigating an awkward family meeting. It was about survival. In the car heading back to San Francisco, Nathaniel remained silent for several minutes, his expression unreadable as he stared out at the coastline. I'm sorry, he finally said. He was worse than I expected. I think I handled him, Julia replied, still trying to process the encounter. You did more than handle him. You impressed him. Nathaniel turned to look at her. That doesn't happen often. Is that good or bad? Both. His expression darkened. He'll be watching us more closely now. The gala next week, it's a test. He wants to see if we can convince 400 of San Francisco's elite that this marriage is real. Julia felt a flutter of panic. How are we supposed to do that? I don't know the first thing about your world. You'll learn. Nathaniel reached across the space between them, taking her hand. The gesture felt different now, less calculated, more instinctive. We have a week to prepare, and after today, I have complete confidence in your ability to adapt. His words should have been reassuring. Instead, Julia felt the weight of what she'd gotten herself into pressing down on her. One meeting with Harrison Cross had been difficult enough. A lifetime of his scrutiny and manipulation seemed impossible. Hey. Nathaniel's voice was softer than she'd heard before. We're in this together, remember? Partners. Julia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. As the car wound its way back toward the city, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. This arrangement had started as a mutually beneficial business deal, a way for her to rebuild after Robert's rejection, and for Nathaniel to secure his inheritance. But facing Harrison Cross had made it clear that they were playing a much more dangerous game than she'd realized, and the stakes weren't just financial. As if reading her thoughts, Nathaniel squeezed her hand. He won't win, Julia. I won't let him hurt you. Like he hurt Eliza, she asked quietly. Nathaniel's expression hardened. Exactly like that. I failed to protect her. I won't make the same mistake twice. The conviction in his voice should have been comforting. Instead, it raised a question Julia hadn't considered before. What had happened in Nathaniel's past that made him so determined to fight his father? And what would happen when their year was up and she was no longer under his protection? As San Francisco appeared on the horizon, gleaming in the afternoon sun, Julia realized there was another, more immediate question she needed to answer. How do you convince the world you're in love with someone you barely know? And more troubling still, what happens when the line between pretense and reality begins to blur? 1 week wasn't nearly enough time to prepare for what Julia now thought of as her public debut. The Cross Foundation Gala wasn't just any social event. It was the event of the San Francisco social season, where the city's wealthiest and most influential gathered to outshine one another while pretending to care about charity. Stop fidgeting, Nathaniel said gently as their car approached the glittering Palace Hotel. "You look beautiful." Julia smoothed the midnight blue gown that Sarah had helped her select, a flowing creation that complemented her wheelchair rather than trying to hide it. "I'm not worried about how I look. I'm worried about saying the wrong thing to the wrong person. Just remember what we practiced. Short answers, deflect with a question if you're uncertain, and let you do most of the talking," Julia finished with a nervous smile. "I know. But there's so many details to remember about us. How we met, our first date, your favorite foods." Nathaniel took her hand, a gesture that had become surprisingly natural over the past week. "We've spent almost every waking hour together for a week. You know me better than most people I've known for years." It was true. The past 7 days had been an intensive crash course in all things Nathaniel Cross. They'd eaten all their meals together, spent evenings talking about their pasts, and even attended a smaller dinner party as practice for tonight. Julia had learned that Nathaniel preferred dark chocolate to milk, could speak fluent Mandarin, and had a secret fondness for old science fiction novels. Small details that made him human beyond his imposing public persona. "Ready?" Nathaniel asked as the car stopped at the red carpet entrance. Julia took a deep breath. "As I'll ever be." The moment they emerged from the car, flashbulbs exploded around them. The society photographers clearly hadn't expected Nathaniel Cross to attend with a wife no one knew existed, let alone one in a wheelchair. Julia held her head high as Nathaniel assisted with her chair, then walked beside her toward the entrance. "Mrs. Cross, over here. Nathaniel, when did you get married? Can we get a statement about your surprise wedding?" The questions flew from all directions. Nathaniel placed a protective hand on Julia's shoulder, his expression composed but distant. "My wife and I are here to support the foundation's work," he said smoothly. "We'll be making a statement later." Inside the grand ballroom, the reaction was more subdued, but no less intense. Conversations paused as they entered, and Julia felt hundreds of eyes tracking their progress across the room. "Nathaniel!" A woman in her 60s, dripping in diamonds, intercepted them. "You sly fox! No one told me you were seeing anyone, let alone married." "Hello, Margaret." Nathaniel bent to kiss her cheek. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Julia. Julia, this is Margaret Blakely, my godmother and oldest family friend." "Lovely to meet you," Julia said, extending her hand. "Nathaniel has told me so much about you." Margaret's sharp eyes assessed Julia from head to toe. "Funny, he's told me absolutely nothing about you." She turned to Nathaniel. "Your father mentioned your sudden marriage, but I thought he must be confused from his medication." Her attention snapped back to Julia. "How exactly did you manage to capture San Francisco's most elusive bachelor?" Julia felt her throat tighten. This was exactly the kind of loaded question they'd prepared for. "I'm afraid it was my art that captured him first," she said, repeating their practice story. "The man bid an obscene amount for one of my paintings. I had to meet someone with such questionable financial judgment." To her relief, Margaret laughed, a genuine sound that softened her aristocratic features. "Well, at least she has a sense of humor, Nathaniel. That's more than I can say for the debutantes your father kept throwing at you." Before Nathaniel could respond, a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. Harrison Cross had arrived, walking with the assistance of a cane, but otherwise showing no signs of his illness. He moved through the crowd like a monarch, accepting greetings and well-wishes with regal nods. "He looks better than last week," Julia murmured to Nathaniel. "He always rallies for public appearances," Nathaniel replied quietly. "Pride is a powerful drug." Harrison's eyes found them across the room, and a cold smile played at his lips before he turned away, deliberately ignoring them. "Let me guess," Julia said. "That's part of his game?" "Divide and conquer," Nathaniel confirmed. "He'll spend the next hour talking to everyone but us, likely spreading his own version of our relationship." "Which is?" "That you're a gold digger who trapped his naive son." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. And that he's generously giving us his blessing despite his concerns. Charming, Julia muttered. So what's our counter-strategy? Nathaniel looked down at her with surprise, then smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious face. I knew I married the right woman. The next 2 hours were a careful dance of conversations, introductions, and navigating the political minefield of San Francisco society. Julia quickly learned who was genuinely friendly, surprisingly few, who was fishing for gossip, nearly everyone, and who was directly in Harrison's pocket, a concerning number of influential people. Through it all, Nathaniel remained at her side, his hand often finding the small of her back or resting on her shoulder. Casual touches that conveyed intimacy to observers. After the initial shock, Julia found herself relaxing into these moments, even initiating some of her own. A touch to his arm when laughing, the brush of her fingers against his when accepting a drink. "You're a natural," Nathaniel murmured during a brief moment alone by the champagne fountain. "Everyone's talking about how clearly besotted I am." "And what about me?" Julia asked, accepting the glass he offered. "Am I convincingly in love?" Something flickered in Nathaniel's eyes. "You're convincing," he said carefully, "though I noticed you deflect personal questions about me rather than answer them. I thought that was the plan." "It is. It's just—" He hesitated. "When I talk about you, I find I don't need to deflect. I've learned enough to speak genuinely." The implication hung between them. Before Julia could respond, a tall man with a politician's smile approached them. "Nathaniel, and this must be the mysterious bride everyone's talking about." His gaze flicked to Julia's wheelchair with barely disguised discomfort. "James Harrington. I'm on the board with Nathaniel." "Julia Cross," she replied, noticing how easily the name now came to her lips. "Pleasure to meet you." "I was just telling Harrison how surprising this match is," Harrington continued, his smile not reaching his eyes. "He mentioned you're an artist. How fascinating. I don't believe I've seen your work in any of the major galleries." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Julia felt Nathaniel tense beside her, but she placed a hand on his arm, a silent request to let her handle this. "Not yet," she said smoothly. "But that's changing. I have a show opening at the Pearson Gallery next month. You're welcome to attend, though I should warn you, my pieces start at 6 figures these days. The benefits of having a discerning collector for a husband." Harrington's smile faltered. "The Pearson? That's impressive, though I wonder if your connection to the Cross name might have helped secure such a prestigious venue." "Actually," Nathaniel interjected, "Julia secured the show before we were married. Martin Pearson has been following her work for years. He's been trying to convince her to show exclusively with him for months." Julia shot him a surprised look. This wasn't part of their practice story. "It's true." A new voice joined the conversation. A silver-haired man in his 60s approached their group. "I've been after Julia to commit to a show for nearly a year. Hello, my dear. Congratulations on your marriage." "Martin," Julia recovered quickly, recognizing the name of one of San Francisco's most respected gallery owners. "Thank you for coming." "Wouldn't miss it," Martin Pearson replied, his kind eyes twinkling behind round glasses. "Especially now that my favorite artist is married to one of my oldest friend's son." "You know Julia's work?" Harrington asked, clearly reassessing the situation. "Know it? I've been collecting it since before her accident." Martin's emphasis on the timeline was subtle but pointed. "Her use of light is reminiscent of Turner, but with a modern sensibility that's entirely her own. The show next month will be the event of the season in the art world." Julia struggled to keep her expression neutral. There was no show, no relationship with Martin Pearson. This was Nathaniel's doing, an elaborate protection she hadn't anticipated. "If you'll excuse us," Nathaniel said smoothly. "I promised my wife a tour of the hotel's art collection. James, always a pleasure. Martin, we'll see you for dinner next week." As they moved away, Julia waited until they were out of earshot before whispering, "What was that about? There is no show at the Pearson Gallery." "There is now," Nathaniel replied without breaking stride. "Martin owes me a favor. The show opens in 5 weeks. I've already arranged for your work to be professionally photographed and catalogued." Julia stopped her chair abruptly, forcing Nathaniel to turn and face her. "You had no right to do that without asking me." Nathaniel crouched down to her level, his expression serious. "You're right. I should have consulted you first. But when my father started questioning your credentials as an artist, I needed to act quickly." "My credentials?" Julia felt a flare of indignation. "My work stands on its own merit." "I know that," Nathaniel said quietly. "That's why I asked Martin to look at your portfolio last week. The show was his idea, Julia. He genuinely loves your work." Julia didn't know whether to be angry at the presumption or touched by the support. "You should have told me." "I was going to. Tonight, after the gala." His eyes held hers. "I wanted it to be a surprise, a good one for once." Before she could respond, the soft chime of silverware against crystal filled the ballroom. Harrison Cross had taken the stage, commanding attention with his presence alone. "Friends, colleagues, distinguished guests," Harrison began, his voice strong despite his illness. "Welcome to the annual Cross Foundation Gala. Tonight, we celebrate not only the Foundation's charitable work, but also an unexpected family development." Julia felt her stomach tighten as Harrison's pale eyes found her in the crowd. "As many of you know, my son Nathaniel has always been something of a lone wolf." Polite laughter rippled through the audience. "So imagine my surprise when he arrived last week with a wife none of us knew existed." More laughter, though with an undercurrent of curiosity. "In the Cross family, we value commitment, loyalty, and tradition." Harrison's gaze hardened almost imperceptibly. "Which is why I'm pleased to officially welcome Julia Morris, forgive me, Julia Cross, into our family." Applause filled the room as a spotlight suddenly found Julia and Nathaniel. She felt Nathaniel's hand on her shoulder, steadying her under the scrutiny of hundreds of eyes. "To celebrate this union," Harrison continued, "I'm announcing a special addition to tonight's charitable giving. $1 million will be donated in the new couple's name to spinal cord injury research." He raised his glass. "To Nathaniel and Julia, may their marriage be everything they deserve." The toast was met with enthusiastic applause, but Julia wasn't fooled. The emphasis Harrison had placed on their names, the pointed nature of the donation, it was both a public acknowledgement and a challenge. He was telling them he accepted their marriage on the surface, while simultaneously reminding them that he controlled the narrative. "Your father doesn't do anything by halves, does he?" Julia murmured, as the spotlight moved away and the orchestra began playing again. "No," Nathaniel agreed, his expression tight. "But neither do I." He offered his hand. "Dance with me?" Julia blinked in surprise. "I'm in a wheelchair, Nathaniel." "I'm aware." His eyes held hers. "Do you trust me?" After a moment's hesitation, Julia nodded. Nathaniel guided her wheelchair to the edge of the dance floor, then crouched down beside her. "What are you doing?" she whispered, as he placed one hand on her waist and took her hand with the other. "Creating a moment they'll all remember," he replied softly. "Just follow my lead." With subtle movements, Nathaniel began to guide her wheelchair in a slow, graceful pattern across the floor. He danced beside her, their movements synchronized as if they'd practiced for years rather than minutes. Julia felt her initial embarrassment fade as she realized the beauty of what they were creating, a dance that acknowledged her wheelchair rather than trying to hide it. Around them, the crowd fell silent, then parted to give them space. From the corner of her eye, Julia saw Harrison watching, his expression unreadable. But it was the other faces that struck her, the genuine smiles, the whispers of appreciation, even a few discreetly wiped tears. As the music swelled, Nathaniel leaned close to her ear. "They're all watching us." "I know," Julia replied, suddenly very aware of his proximity. "Is this part of the act?" Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression. "No," he said softly. "This isn't for them." The music came to an end, and the room erupted in applause. In that moment, with Nathaniel looking at her with an intensity she couldn't quite decipher, Julia realized something had changed between them. This no longer felt like an arrangement or a performance. It felt dangerously close to something real. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of conversations and congratulations. By the time they left, Julia was exhausted but exhilarated. They had survived their first public test, and by all appearances, they had passed. "You were remarkable," Nathaniel said as they rode the elevator up to his penthouse. "Everyone believed you. Us." Julia studied him in the elevator's soft lighting. Over the past week, she'd begun to read his expressions. The slight tightening around his eyes when he was stressed. The almost imperceptible quirk of his lips when he was genuinely amused rather than socially polite. "Was it all an act?" she asked quietly. "Tonight, I mean. The dance, the way you looked at me." Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. "Not all of it," he finally said as the elevator doors opened. "That's what concerns me." Inside the penthouse, Julia moved to the window wall that had become her favorite spot. The city sparkled below, a tapestry of lights against the darkness. She heard Nathaniel pour 2 drinks, then the soft sound of his approach. "We should talk," he said, handing her a glass of bourbon. "That sounds ominous." Julia took a sip, welcoming the familiar burn. "Let me guess, your father is already plotting our downfall." "Probably," Nathaniel admitted, sitting across from her. "But that's not what I want to discuss." He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "This arrangement between us, it's becoming complicated." Julia felt a flutter of apprehension. "How so?" "I find myself—" Nathaniel paused, choosing his words carefully. "I find myself forgetting sometimes that this is temporary, that it's not real." The confession hung in the air between them. Julia studied his face, searching for signs of manipulation or calculation, but found only vulnerability, a rare glimpse behind his carefully constructed walls. "Nathaniel," she began, unsure how to respond. "We barely know each other." "Don't we?" He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "In the past week, you've learned more about me than people I've known for years. You know about Claire, about my childhood. You've seen me deal with my father, and I've learned about you, your strength, your resilience, your talent. That doesn't change the fact that this started as a business arrangement," Julia reminded him. "You needed a wife to secure your inheritance. I needed, I don't know, a fresh start maybe. And if it's becoming more than that?" The question made Julia's heart race. Part of her wanted to dismiss it, to remind both of them that this was temporary, practical, not emotional. But another part, a growing part, recognized the truth in his words. There was something between them, something unexpected and unpredictable. "I don't think that's wise," she said finally. "You're still grieving Claire. I'm still recovering from Robert's rejection. We're both vulnerable." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "You're right. Of course you're right." He stood and moved to the window beside her. "But what if I don't want to be wise? What if for once I want to take a chance on something I didn't plan or calculate?" Julia looked up at him. This man who had entered her life so suddenly and changed it so completely. "What are you saying, Nathaniel?" He turned to face her, his expression more open than she'd ever seen it. "I'm saying that I don't want to pretend anymore. Not with you." He crouched down to her level, a gesture she'd come to appreciate for its respect. "When we agreed to this arrangement, we said 1 year, then reevaluate. I'm reevaluating now. It's been a week, Julia pointed out. The most eye-opening week of my life. He took her hands in his. I know this is fast. I know it doesn't make sense. But I haven't felt this way in maybe ever. And I hope, you might feel something too. Julia couldn't deny the connection that had formed between them, the ease she felt in his presence despite the extraordinary circumstances. But fear held her back, fear of being hurt again, of misreading the situation, of confusing gratitude with deeper feelings. I can't give you an answer right now, she said honestly. This is too important to rush. For both of us. Relief washed over his features. I'm not asking for an answer. I'm asking for a chance. A real one. His thumbs traced circles on her palms. Let's stop seeing this as a temporary arrangement with an expiration date. Let's treat it as an opportunity to see if what we're feeling might grow into something genuine. And if it doesn't, Julia had to ask, if in a month or 2 or 6, we realize this was just proximity and unusual circumstances, then we end it, amicably and honestly. Nathaniel's expression was solemn. You keep everything we agreed upon, the financial security, the gallery connections, no strings, no guilt. It was a generous offer, perhaps too generous. Why would you take that risk? You could lose everything. Not everything, Nathaniel corrected. Only money, which I have plenty of regardless of my father's trust. But if we don't try, his voice softened. I think we'd both be losing something potentially much more valuable. Julia closed her eyes, trying to sort through her conflicting emotions. When she opened them, Nathaniel was watching her with a patience that touched her deeply. How would this work? She asked finally. Just carrying on as we have been, but with the understanding that it might become real. Essentially. Nathaniel released her hands but remained at her level. We continue as we have been, getting to know each other, building a life together. But we're honest about what we're feeling, where this might go. No more pretending or performances, at least not with each other. The proposition was both terrifying and tempting. Julia had never been a risk-taker, her career as an artist notwithstanding. She preferred certainty, security, knowing the path ahead. But life had taught her that certainty was an illusion. Her accident had taken away her dancing career in an instant. Robert had proven that 5 years of promises could vanish in a moment of truth. Perhaps it was time to embrace uncertainty rather than fear it. I can't promise anything, she said carefully, but I'm willing to see where this goes, to be open to possibilities. The smile that spread across Nathaniel's face was unlike any she'd seen before, unguarded, genuine, almost boyish in its delight. That's all I'm asking for. A comfortable silence fell between them as they both absorbed the implications of this new understanding. Outside, the city continued its nighttime symphony of lights and distant sounds. Inside, something fragile and precious had begun to take shape. So, Julia said finally, a small smile playing at her lips. What happens now, husband? Nathaniel's eyes warmed at the term, no longer just a legal designation, but a possibility. Now, wife, we face my father, your family, the society pages, and whatever else comes our way. He reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture intimate in its simplicity. Together, as partners, for real this time. Partners, Julia repeated, the word no longer simply part of a business arrangement, but a promise of something more. 3 months later, Julia stood, or rather, sat, in the center of the Pearson Gallery, surrounded by her artwork and a crowd of admiring patrons. The show had been Nathaniel's gift to her, but the success was entirely her own. Critics had praised her unique perspective and transcendent use of light and space. Several pieces had sold within the first hour, red dots appearing beside their placards like badges of honor. I always knew you had it in you, Melissa said, appearing at her side with 2 glasses of champagne. "Though I admit, I still can't believe how all this happened." She nodded toward Nathaniel, who was deep in conversation with a museum curator across the room. Julia accepted the champagne with a smile. "Sometimes I can't believe it either." Their arrangement had evolved in ways neither of them could have predicted. What had begun as a calculated business deal had transformed into something authentic and surprisingly strong. They still had their challenges: Harrison's continued machinations, the occasional newspaper article questioning their whirlwind romance, Julia's ongoing adjustment to life in Nathaniel's world. But they faced those challenges together, no longer pretending, but truly united. "He looks at you like you hung the moon," Melissa observed, following Julia's gaze to Nathaniel. "It's sickeningly sweet, actually." Julia laughed. "We're still figuring things out, taking it day by day." "Well, whatever you're doing, it's working. I haven't seen you this happy in years." Melissa squeezed her shoulder. "Just be careful, okay? Happy endings are great in fairy tales, but real life is more complicated." "Trust me, I know," Julia assured her. "But sometimes, Mel, the complications are worth it." As if sensing her attention, Nathaniel looked up and caught Julia's eye across the crowded gallery. The smile he gave her, private and warm despite the public setting, sent a familiar flutter through her chest. Without excusing himself from his conversation, he raised his glass in a silent toast to her success. Julia returned the gesture, marveling at the unexpected journey that had brought them here. 6 months ago, she had been preparing to marry a man who couldn't accept her as she was. Now she was married to a man who saw beyond her wheelchair, beyond her limitations, to the person she truly was, and was helping her build a life neither of them had imagined possible. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, of adjustment, of learning each other's boundaries and needs. Harrison Cross remained a shadow in their lives, watching and waiting for them to fail. The trust condition had been satisfied, but his skepticism about their marriage never wavered. But for the first time since her accident, Julia felt like she was moving forward rather than simply adapting to limitations. Her art was thriving, her confidence growing, and her heart, once so carefully guarded, was opening to possibilities she'd thought forever lost. Later that evening, as they returned to what was now truly their home, Nathaniel helped Julia from her wheelchair onto the sofa they often shared during quiet evenings together. "To the artist of the hour," he said, refilling their champagne glasses, "your show was extraordinary, Julia, just like you." "It wouldn't have happened without you," she acknowledged, accepting the glass. "It would have," Nathaniel countered firmly. "Maybe not now, maybe not at the Pearson, but your talent was always going to find its audience." He settled beside her. "I just expedited the inevitable." Julia laughed at his characteristic confidence. "Well, thank you for the expedition, then." "You're welcome." His expression grew more serious. "But I should be thanking you." "For what?" "For taking a chance. On the arrangement. On us." Nathaniel took her hand, his thumb brushing over the wedding ring that had once been merely a prop, but now held meaning. "When I proposed to you at that wedding, I thought I was offering you an escape. I never imagined you would end up saving me instead." Julia shook her head. "I didn't save you, Nathaniel." "You did," he insisted, "from a life of isolation, from becoming my father." His voice softened. "From forgetting what matters." The simple sincerity of his words touched her deeply. This man, who had once seemed so remote and controlled, had slowly revealed layers of warmth and vulnerability she treasured all the more for their rarity. "We saved each other," Julia said, squeezing his hand. "And we'll keep doing that, I think. Day by day, challenge by challenge." Nathaniel's smile held a promise that made her heart swell. "I look forward to it, Mrs. Cross." As the city lights twinkled beyond their window, Julia reflected on the strange and winding path that had led her here. Robert's rejection, once so devastating, now seemed like a necessary detour, a wrong turn that had ultimately led her in the right direction. She was not the same woman who had sat heartbroken in her wedding dress all those months ago. She was stronger, more confident, more truly herself than she had been in years. And Nathaniel was not the cold, calculating businessman he had first appeared to be, but a man of depth and principle who had his own wounds to heal. They were, as he had said from the beginning, partners, equal in strength and vulnerability, in giving and receiving. Their arrangement had transformed into something neither of them had anticipated, but both now cherished, a marriage in more than just name. Day by day, Nathaniel agreed, drawing her closer, beginning with today. Julia leaned into his embrace, no longer worried about what tomorrow might bring. Whatever challenges awaited them, Harrison's schemes, society's judgments, their own fears and doubts, they would face them together. Not as part of an arrangement or a business deal, but as partners who had chosen each other, freely and fully. And in that choice was a power that no contract could capture and no arrangement could define. The power of a love that had grown not from fantasy or necessity, but from the genuine discovery of each other's true selves. It wasn't the fairy tale ending Julia had once dreamed of. It was better. It was real.